The pale yellow light in the veterinary clinic reflected off the cold white tiles. The room was so quiet that all you could hear was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the old dog's weak breathing. Buddy, a 14-year-old golden retriever, lay curled on a towel on the examination table. His once shiny coat was matted, his back bent with age and disease. His cloudy eyes held only a faint glimmer of his final attachment. Thomas Miller, 64, sat next to Buddy, his hand gently stroking his soft ears, which were now trembling slightly. "You're the best friend I've ever had, Buddy," he whispered, his throat tight. "I'm sorry. If there was anything I could do to keep you, I would." The veterinarian stood silently to one side, syringe ready, but no one rushed her. The room seemed to be in a space between love and separation. Then, the unexpected happened. Buddy struggled to lift his head, his forelegs trembling, and gently wrapped himself around Thomas's neck, pulling him close. A hug, slow, weak, but meaningful. Thomas held his breath, letting the tears fall as he felt the remaining warmth of his loyal friend in his arms. No one in the room said anything. The nurse put her hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. The vet bowed his head silent in the sacred moment. It was no longer a farewell. It was a thank you, a farewell hug of immeasurable loyalty. The room was silent after Buddy's unexpected hug. Thomas Miller didn't take his eyes off the old dog. He just sat there holding Buddy's thin, tired body tightly, as if he was afraid that if he let go, the moment would disappear. He thought it was his last goodbye, his last hug. But then something unusual happened. Dr. Emily, who had been a veterinarian for nearly 20 years, walked slowly forward, preparing to administer the permanent sedative. But as she leaned in, her gaze faltered. She squinted, then frowned. "Wait," she said softly, almost in a whisper. She placed the syringe on the metal tray, then leaned in close to Buddy. Both Thomas and the nurse looked at her surprised. "Did you hear something?" Thomas asked, his voice still hoarse from crying. Emily put the stethoscope to Buddy's chest. She counted the beats, then counted again. It wasn't the heartbeat of a dying dog. It was a weak, steady fighting beat. She checked the color of Buddy's gums, then looked at the nurse. "Give me a thermometer, check Buddy's blood again." "Something's not right." Thomas blinked, not quite understanding what was happening. "What did you say?" Emily looked at him, her voice serious. "I don't think Buddy is dying of old age. It's likely that this is severe sepsis or some kind of acute reaction. If that's the case, we can still save him," Thomas choked. A ray of hope shot through his heart like a light in the darkness. He clenched his calloused hands. "If there's a chance, save him. Do whatever you can." Emily nodded. "We'll fight with you. Buddy's not ready to give up." In that moment, the silence of the room was no longer pain. It was the dawn of a miracle just beginning. As the vital signs became clearer, the small veterinary clinic shifted into motion. Dr. Emily gave quick instructions, her hands shaking slightly with adrenaline, but her eyes steady. "We don't have much time," she told the nurse. "We need to get fluids started immediately. Broad-spectrum antibiotics AFUA." Buddy, still lying on the thin sheet, breathed heavily. But each breath was no longer a sign of impending death, but evidence of a silent fight, a small ray of hope in the darkness. Thomas Miller sat silently beside him, his hands clasped tightly together. He couldn't take his eyes off the dog, who had been with him for nearly a decade, from afternoon jogs in the park to cold days spent alone in their cabin warming themselves. He survived pneumonia when he was little, Thomas whispered almost to himself. "I think this time, it's over." But Buddy's eyes, though cloudy, followed him. And the faint wagging of his tail, even if only a beat, seemed to say, "Don't give up." The machine started up. Buddy's temperature was closely monitored. A needle was inserted into an IV in his leg, pumping a warm, invigorating stream of medicine. Emily whispered, "His body is weak, but his heart is still fighting." An hour passed, then 2. Every vital sign was carefully recorded. Dr. Emily was stunned as Buddy began to respond. His blood pressure rose slightly, his pulse became stronger, his breathing became less shallow. Thomas. The dog responded with a soft sigh, and for the first time in days that sigh no longer signaled an end, but the beginning of a new life. The treatment room was kept scrupulously quiet. Every sound was muted, even the sound of footsteps. the shuffling of papers, the whisper of the vitals monitor. Outside the window, night had long since fallen, casting a chill over the city. Inside, a pale yellow light bathed Buddy's thin figure, still lying silently on the treatment table, an IV in his leg, his heartbeat echoing in the air like a clock counting down the precious seconds. Thomas didn't move. He sat on the small metal chair beside him, hunched forward, his hands clasped on his knees. His eyes were red, either from exhaustion or from the hope that had just emerged from the depths of despair. There were moments when he thought he was dreaming, that he had said goodbye, felt the last embrace, and Buddy was still there, still fighting to come back. Dr. Emily walked back and forth between patients, but her eyes always glanced toward the treatment table where Buddy lay. Every time she saw Thomas bend down to pat the dog's head, her heart sank. Sometimes she had told the nurse animals survive not because of the medicine, but because of the love they feel. Time passed slowly, like candy melting in the mouth. The night was long. At 2 a.m., Buddy suddenly started slightly. His head lifted slightly, his eyes wandering around lazily. Thomas quickly leaned closer. "Buddy, it's me, Thomas." His skinny tail moved slightly. For the first time since entering the clinic, Thomas burst into tears without control. They were not tears of sadness, but of returning faith of a revival in his heart. The parting hug turned out not to be a goodbye, but a last hold for a loyal soul not to give up. And in that quiet night beside his old friend, who was teetering between life and death, Thomas knew they still had time, even if it was just a day, a week, or longer. But it was time they thought was lost forever. Dawn crept through the thin curtains of the treatment room, pouring the first rays of light onto the cold tile floor and Buddy's hospital bed. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of the heart monitor and the soft breathing of the man who had stayed up all night beside his loyal dog. Thomas had not left yet. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes were dark from lack of sleep, but his face was radiant with relief. Beside him, Buddy the dog, who seemed to have one foot in the grave, was sleeping soundly. His breathing was slow but even, and he was no longer as cold as before. An IV dripped hope into his neck in the form of antibiotics and fluids. Dr. Emily walked in, holding a chart and medical records. After a night of close monitoring, Buddy was responding well to the medication. "He's a fighter," she said to Thomas, "and maybe you're the reason he's not giving up." Thomas said nothing. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on Buddy, still frail, but no longer the image of an end, but a new beginning. News of Buddy began to spread beyond the clinic. A young nurse, moved by the moment of a goodbye hug that turned into a resurrection, shared the story on social media. Within hours, thousands of shares and comments poured in. People called it a life-saving hug and praised Thomas's perseverance as well as Buddy's miraculous instincts. The dog knew how to cling to hope, even in the darkest of moments. Strangers began sending gifts, well wishes, and financial support for hospital bills. An animal rescue organization offered to use Buddy's story in a media campaign about the power of love and loyalty. In the pristine white room, Thomas leaned down and whispered softly into Buddy's ear, "You're not just a dog, Buddy. You're a miracle." And for the first time since that fateful night, Buddy wagged his tail audibly, as a response without needing to speak. News of the life-saving hug between Thomas and Buddy quickly spread beyond town. Local television stations picked up the story, and in less than 2 days, the story was on national news. It was heartbreaking to see the frail old dog, seemingly on the verge of death, suddenly hugging his owner tightly around the neck as if to say, "Don't give up on me." In the small town where Thomas lived, the event sparked an unprecedented outpouring of love. People who had never met him showed up at the vet clinic to ask about him. Children sent doodles of a dog with his arm around a man's shoulder with the innocent caption, "Buddy, the dog who hugged hope." Thomas is a private person, usually avoiding the camera lens, but this time he did not refuse. When asked by reporters, he simply answered, "I think Buddy taught me a lesson that I will never forget. That even if you think you've hit rock bottom, as long as there's one person who believes in you, hope is not dead." The veterinary hospital where Buddy was being treated also suddenly became the most visited place in town. Animal lovers came to give food blankets and donations to a senior pet support fund. A fund called the Buddy Fund was established to help with the medical expenses of senior dogs awaiting end-of-life treatment. As for Thomas, all he wanted was to sit next to his best friend every day. His hand was always placed gently on Buddy's head, and his eyes still sparkled with gratitude. Not only for Buddy's survival, but for the bond Buddy had brought together an entire community through his quiet love of animals. A week had passed since Buddy had wrapped his legs around Thomas's neck in the clinic, and everything had changed. Buddy was no longer the dying dog. Though still weak, his eyes were no longer cloudy. His breathing was more even, and every time Thomas walked into the room, his thin tail would flick the blanket in a silent greeting. The vets were astonished. After aggressive treatment with antibiotics and fluids, Buddy began to recover, a miracle they didn't expect. They called him the Silent Warrior, and often stopped by to pet him before each shift. Thomas, as usual, sat next to Buddy for hours that day. No longer were there tears of sadness, but now there were eyes of hope and gratitude. "I thought it was time to let go," he told a friend, but Buddy wouldn't let me. The day Buddy stood up and took his first few steps, the entire clinic erupted in cheers. For Thomas, it was more than just a dog's rebirth. It was the beginning of a newfound trust, a bond, and an unspoken but everlasting friendship. The touching story of Thomas and his dog Buddy delivers a profound message about unconditional love and the power of hope. In what seems like the last moment, an unexpected hug from a dog not only changes the mood of the room, but also changes fate. When people are ready to give up, it is the invisible bond between two souls, human and pet, that awakens courage and belief that there is still a miracle ahead. The lesson here is clear. Don't give up even when it seems like the end. Sometimes just a glimmer of hope, a small act, a look, a hug, or a presence is enough to lift a heart that has grown silent. In life, there will be times when we face loss and despair, but remember that love, perseverance, and faith always have the power to heal, even wounds that seem irreparable. That is the miracle that only the human heart and the dog's can bring.